Welcome to another deep dive, and this time we're really going deep. We're going to be talking about propaganda.
Ooh, very interesting.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and we'll be using excerpts from the audiobook Age of Propaganda by Anthony Pratkanis and Elliot Aronson. I think you'll find it pretty eye-opening how these persuasive tactics are used all around us every day.
I'm intrigued. I mean, most people probably don't even realize how often these techniques are influencing, their everyday decisions and their opinions. It's kind of wild when you start to really see it.
Right, and the thing is, a lot of this isn't some big evil conspiracy. It's often just, baked into how we communicate as humans,
No, I agree.
So the book starts by making a distinction between persuasion and propaganda. Can you help us understand what sets these two apart?
Yeah, sure. So think of persuasion as an open conversation. You've got two sides, right? And they present their arguments. And then you, like the listener, you get to weigh the evidence and make a choice. That's how a good, healthy debate should work.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So then where does propaganda fit in?
Propaganda, it kind of skips the whole rational discussion part. Instead of appealing to your logic, it relies on these sneaky little tricks to bypass your critical thinking and just plant an idea in your head without you even realizing what's happening.
Kind of creepy when you put it like that.
Yeah, it's like a mental magic trick almost.
Well, the book gives a great example about how beef is labeled. It's like 75% lean sounds way better than 25% fat.
Right.
Even though it's literally the same thing.
It is.
It's all about how you spin it.
Yeah, that's a classic example of framing. Propagandists, they really know how to use language to their advantage. They understand that how information is presented can totally change how people see it. It's not just about using positive words, but more like triggering certain emotions or associations.
So they're creating a certain impression, not necessarily conveying truth.
You got it. Think about trying to sell a car, for example. You could focus on its safety features, right? But if you want to target a specific kind of buyer, you might play up its speed or how sporty it looks, even if it's not the safest car on the road.
Right, yeah. What about the messenger? Does that play a role in propaganda too?
Absolutely. Source credibility is huge. They want someone we already trust or admire to deliver their message, so we're less likely to question it.
That way we see all those celebrity endorsements everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just because you see a famous athlete holding a box of cereal doesn't mean they actually know anything about nutrition, right? But we tend to transfer that trust and admiration to whatever they're selling.
And we don't even think twice about it.
Yeah.
So we've got framing, we've got source credibility. What other techniques do these propaganda masters use?
Well, fear is a big one. Fear-mongering. By making people feel afraid or vulnerable, propagandists create a need for their, solution, whatever that is.
It's like those political campaigns that always focus on crime, even when crime rates are actually going down.
Exactly. They prey on our anxieties to push their agendas. They might launch a war on drugs, or they might ramp up military spending, but the underlying message is always, hey, you need us to keep you safe.
It's that whole problem, reaction, solution thing, right?
Exactly. Create a problem, get people riled up, and then swoop in with the solution. And the crazy thing is, it works so well. When we're scared, we don't think as clearly. We grasp for easy answers, even if they're not the best ones in the long run.
Right. It's like that part of our brain that assesses risk just gets overwhelmed by the part that just wants to feel safe no matter what. So we've talked about these external forces, like framing, source credibility, and fear. But is there something about how our own minds work that makes us, vulnerable to this kind of manipulation?
There are a few psychological quirks that make us easy targets. One is this need to rationalize our actions, even when we know they're not the best.
Could you give us an example?
Sure. Imagine a smoker who knows cigarettes are bad for them, but they keep smoking anyway. They might say things like, oh, I only smoke a few a day, or I'll quit eventually. It's this self-justification that lets them avoid facing the fact that they're harming themselves.
So instead of changing their behavior, they change how they think about it to make it okay in their own mind.
Right, and this is exactly what propagandists love. Think about tobacco companies. Their goal isn't to convince people that smoking is healthy. It's to give them just enough justification to feel okay about continuing to smoke.
That's kind of a scary thought. It's like we're helping them manipulate us. What other psychological weaknesses, I guess, do they tap into?
This need to belong, to be part of a group. It's human nature, right? We crave connection. Propagandists know this, and they exploit it by creating this strong us versus them mentality.
So they divide people into groups and then pit them against each other.
Precisely. And this creates a sense of loyalty within the group, and people become much more likely to just accept whatever the group believes, no questions asked. You see this at political rallies, even with sports rivalries. They emphasize shared values, a common enemy. It's powerful stuff.
Yeah, it triggers our tribal instincts.
Wow.
We're wired to trust our own tribe and be suspicious of outsiders.
Right, and propagandists can use that to control people's behavior. Once they decide who's in the good group and who's in the bad group, it's much easier to manipulate people's actions.
Wow, this is pretty intense. So far, we've seen how propaganda uses framing, source credibility, fear, and then it plays on our need to rationalize and our need to belong. It's a lot to take in. I'm kind of wondering, where do we go from here? Does it get even more complex?
It does. Next time, we'll look at how propaganda is used in really high-stakes situations, like wartime and cults.
So before, we were getting into how our minds make us kind of vulnerable to propaganda.
Yeah.
But it's not just about what's going on in our heads, right? I mean, the book talks about how the way media works these days makes us even more susceptible.
Oh yeah, totally. The authors make a pretty strong case that the whole information environment we live in today, it's a breeding ground for propaganda.
It does feel like we're just constantly bombarded with news and opinions and advertising. Everywhere you look, it's just information overload.
Exactly, and with social media, everyone's got a voice, which is great, but it also means it's even harder to filter through everything. And with all that noise, complex issues end up getting oversimplified.
Yeah, it's like we're drawn to the quick and easy, the soundbite, the headline that grabs our attention, even if it doesn't give us the full story.
Right, we want the gist, and that's what makes it so easy for propaganda to slip in. Propagandists, they know that in a world of short attention spans, they don't have to give you some long, complicated argument. Just hit you with a message that's easy to remember and stirs up your emotions.
Makes sense. The book talks about Richard Nixon's campaign promise of honorable peace in Vietnam as an example. And what does that even mean? It's so vague.
Right, exactly. It was this empty phrase that could mean different things to different people. It appealed to this general desire for peace without actually saying anything concrete about how to achieve it.
So it's not about clarity then, it's more about creating this illusion that everyone's on the same page, even if they're not.
Exactly. And, most people don't have time to fact check everything they hear. Who has the time for that, right?
So basically, we're left trying to sort through this massive jumble of information where it's harder and harder to figure out what's true and what's not. So are we just doomed? Are we just stuck being passive consumers of whatever they feed us?
Not necessarily. The book emphasizes awareness as the first line of defense. If you can recognize the techniques they're using, you can start to see past the manipulation. It's like having a BS detector.
Okay, so more critical thinking.
Yeah.
But how do we actually do that? What are some concrete steps?
One big thing is to get your information from a bunch of different sources. Don't just stick with one news outlet or one social media feed.
Makes sense. If you only hear one side of the story, it's easy to get stuck in an echo chamber.
Totally. And don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
When you see something that gets a strong reaction from you, stop and think for a second. Is this overly dramatic? Is it playing on my fears? Is it trying to make me see things as us versus them?
Like a mental checklist, sort of.
Yeah, and don't just take everything at face value. Dig a little deeper, look for evidence, consider the source. And if something seems too good to be true or too simple for a complex issue, be suspicious.
So basically, take charge, be an active participant instead of just letting the information wash over you. So before we were talking about propaganda in really intense situations like war and cults. What are some examples of that?
Well, think about wartime propaganda. Often it uses fear and dehumanization to get people to support the war effort. Like in World War II, both sides were using posters that made the enemy look like monsters. It made it easier to justify the violence.
Oh yeah, it's like taking away their humanity so you don't feel as bad about fighting them.
Exactly. And that kind of propaganda can have consequences that last long after the war is over. It shapes how entire groups of people are seen and treated for generations.
That's a powerful point. What about cults? How do they use propaganda?
Cults, they often isolate their members, keep them away from family and friends, shower them with love and approval, but only if they follow the rules, and discourage any kind of questioning. It's all about control.
It creates this bubble where the only reality you see is the one they're feeding you.
Exactly. And once you're in that bubble, it can be really hard to break free. This has been a lot, hasn't it?
Yeah, it really makes you think. It's clear that propaganda can be super subtle or totally in your face, and it can be really hard to spot sometimes. But it sounds like awareness is key.
Absolutely. The more you know about how it works, the better prepared you are to resist it.
That's a good point. We're not totally powerless. We can protect ourselves. We'll be right back to wrap things up and talk about what we can all do to fight back against propaganda. Okay, we're back. And, after talking about all these ways we can be manipulated, it's easy to feel kind of helpless. Like, how do you fight something that's so ingrained in how our minds work?
Yeah, I get that. It can be discouraging. But the authors of Age of Propaganda, they actually end on a pretty hopeful note. They say that education is like our best defense against this stuff.
So the more we know, the better we can spot it and resist it.
Exactly. It's like, think about a magician, right? Once you know how the trick is done, it's not so magical anymore.
Yeah, you start to see the strings.
Right, you see behind the curtain. And the same thing happens with propaganda. Once you know the techniques, it's harder for them to fool you.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it's not just about each of us individually, right? It's got to be a bigger thing.
Oh, for sure. We have to, create a culture where critical thinking is valued and encouraged. That means teaching it in schools, demanding more transparency from our leaders, holding the media accountable.
So, changing the rules of the game so it's not so easy for them to manipulate us?
Right, exactly. And it starts with each one of us being more aware of the messages we're consuming and the messages we're putting out there.
So before we hit that share button or retweet something, think about it.
Yeah, exactly. Ask yourself, who's benefiting from this message? What techniques are they using? Am I getting the full story?
Be an active participant, not just blindly accepting everything you see.
Right. And don't be complacent. This stuff matters. Propaganda can really damage trust, divide communities, even lead to violence.
This is not just some abstract concept. It has real-world consequences.
Absolutely. But remember, we're not powerless. The more we learn to recognize propaganda and resist it, the better chance we have of creating a more informed, fair, and just world.
This is a really insightful conversation. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something today. Remember, stay curious, stay critical, and keep questioning everything.